And he comes over and he says, I want to buy this car. And they laugh. They're like, yeah, okay, kid. When my grandfather had his service facility in Springfield, Massachusetts, he came here as an immigrant, did very well for himself over a few years, but was also a very, very generous guy. He was really hoping that my father would not become a mechanic like him. He was hoping my father would become a stockbroker or a doctor, or one of those things like a lot of first-generation immigrant parents hope that their children become. So my grandfather was a car guy, but he wasn't insanely passionate about cars. He worked on Ferraris and Lamborghinis in the 60s before anyone. There was, let's say, maybe 5 or 6 other people in the US that did that at the time. And he was an incredible engineer, very, very smart guy, and very hard worker. My dad, on the other hand, was just insanely passionate about cars, almost to a level that is unparalleled by anyone I have ever met today in the classic car community. And that's a bold statement. I've met some of the most incredible designers, engineers, manufacturers. My grandfather said if he got straight A's or he got A's in school, he could have a choice of his first car. And his first car was actually a Lamborghini Miura. So imagine 16 years old driving to high school in a green Lamborghini Miura P400. And that wasn't just his last Miura. My father bought the green car later, sold it for a Miura S, and then another Miura S. You know, looking back at old photos, there's some great photos of him driving the S all over Massachusetts. He used to take the Mass Pike, and he used to drive it pretty fast. There's some great stories of him driving it so fast once that he actually broke all the points. He revved the car so high, didn't blow the motor. He thought the engine was blown. He was doing what a 18-year-old, 19-year-old would do with a Lamborghini Miura in the late 1960s, early 1970s. Every year at that point, the New York Auto Show was probably, besides Geneva, one of the world's most prestigious auto shows. It was at the Javits Center, and my father and his father would go every year, and it was like an important time for them because prior to social media and all these things, I mean, the auto shows where you got to see the new cars and experience them firsthand. That year, it would have been April of 1972. My grandfather was getting some surgery in his back. It was nothing serious, but he couldn't make it. And my father decided he wanted to go to the New York Auto Show himself. My father makes the journey, and he actually drives from Massachusetts. He would drive his Miura S all the time. So he drives his Miura S to New York for the auto show. And he's, going through all the stands, and there's, Ferrari and Jaguar. He loved E-types at the time, and it was cool. They had accessories, and he tells me all these great stories. He would buy shift knobs and all these great things. And when he gets to the Lamborghini stand, he sees a black 1972 Lamborghini Miura SV. And it wasn't just any Miura SV. This was a black car with a unique interior. It was called Pelle Sinape, but it was a very orange, tan, like almost stunning pigskin interior. Full leather, which was actually rare for Miuras at the time. They had vinyl interior, they had different seat inserts. But this car had full leather interior. The distributor at the time for the New York Auto Show, they did a lot of special features. They put special badging. And the car even had, imagine at that time, a telephone in a CB that they actually installed for the New York Auto Show. So my dad sees this car, and being the passionate guy he was and is still today, he freaks out. So Modena Racing was the distributor for Lamborghini in the 1970s for the US. And very famous guys that actually owned it, Alberto and Alfredo. And these guys later had careers with Ferrari and etc. And he goes to them, and they see this young guy, imagine, I think he was 19 at the time, with his long hair. He had bell bottoms. He probably had high shoes at the time because that was in for style. And he comes over and he says, I want to buy this car. And they laugh. They're like, yeah, okay, kid. Yeah, you're going to buy this car. No, I want to buy this car. So they start talking, and they tell me, the car's $20,000. No, I want it. So they're shocked, and they agree. So he negotiates a little bit on the price, and they agree. And he immediately realizes he has to sell his Miura S to then pay for this Miura SV. So he starts making some phone calls. I think he went back to Springfield, Massachusetts, started making phone calls. All of a sudden, everyone is telling him he's absolutely crazy. So imagine 1972 is significant because of the fuel crisis, and the year after the Cannonball, with Brock Yates protesting about speed limits. So this was an interesting time for the automotive world, and an interesting time especially to buy a V12 Lamborghini. So my father immediately sells the Miura S to one of his service clients that had always wanted the car, and he goes with a friend of his. I think it was in some big American Lincoln or Cadillac, and they go back. And he buys the car literally off the show stand. He didn't want them to leave the car there. He was probably worried about someone touching it, someone, scratching it. Again, I'll stress that he's very OCD. And literally removes the car from the show stand and drives it back to Massachusetts. And he tells me these great stories. I mean, imagine at that time driving a Miura SV through New York City. I can't even imagine what it would have been like. The sensory for all this stuff was much less than. Again, we didn't have social media, so seeing a car like this was absolutely shocking. And not only did he just buy the car, but he actually filled up his friend's Cadillac or whatever it was with parts, and actually went to Modena Racing, which was located in New York City, and said, I want spare parts, I want extra this, I want this. And imagine at a 19-year-old age, thought to buy all the parts. He loved this car so much, he never drove it fast. He barely actually drove it. He drove it, I think, through the old Boston roads in that area. He drove it about 5,000, 6,000 miles. And then when he moved to Florida in 1978 or 79, he barely drove it in Florida. He didn't like the roads. He was worried about the heat, etc. So this car essentially stayed as a time capsule with my father through the 80s and into the 90s. Now remember, my dad's a very passionate guy, but he's also OCD. During that time, the Italians painted Miuras, and actually up until Countachs and Diablos, they painted the cars pretty poorly. They were in lacquer paint. The paint didn't always last so well. So imagine you had this Miura SV that was a complete time capsule, and the interior was perfect, the mechanical was perfect, all the rubbers, all the little tags, stickers, everything was absolutely perfect. But my dad decided that even though the paint was completely beautiful, he had to repaint the car. So my father actually ended up hiring some of the best painters from around the world to help him repaint the car. And he spent close to 10, maybe 12 years blocking it perfectly, dismantling parts while preserving the original interior, preserving the original mechanical. I think I've seen the car outside once in my entire lifetime. I've never driven the car. I think I've sat in the driver's seat maybe about 4 times, and that was to bleed the brakes. Once a month, and at certain points even twice a month, my dad starts the car up. He tries the horn, he tests the blinkers, he tests everything. It has its original AC, turns on the AC, and he checks everything to make sure it's still perfect in running order. Imagine he doesn't use the car, but even if something wasn't working, he would fix it immediately. So he would bleed the brakes, and he would do all these things over the years to essentially perfectly preserve this car. As time went on, obviously the Miura prices have gone up insane. I can only imagine today what a true survivor with concours quality paint Miura SV would be worth. Low mileage, a one-off car for the New York Auto Show. My dad's not a rich man by any means, but he's turned down some crazy offers and would probably never sell for any amount. We joke, and I've joked with him. I said, would you take 5 million? Would you take 10 million? He says, hell no. I mean, there's no question in his mind that this is a love affair with this car, and it's so special to him. And I've even thought about, one day, he always says, it's John's car, and one day it's going to be John's car. But even the responsibility, imagine, of having this car, because he's loved and cared for it for so many years. It was actually invited numerous times to Pebble Beach. It's been invited to certain Lamborghini functions as like the star of the event as a Miura SV. And every time he's actually turned Lamborghini, he's turned Pebble Beach down because he's worried of outside elements. He's worried of someone touching it. He's worried of anything that could potentially happen to this car. And it's essentially preserved today in a bubble. He's the only person that's ever worked on it. He's shown probably 20 to 30 people the car over the past 10 years. I've been allowed to take a few photos of the car. I think I've maybe posted an interior shot, an engine shot. Growing up, sometimes you resent your crazy dad, or you're like, oh, he's too much a perfectionist with this car. But now, as I've gotten older, I've really learned to appreciate and have such a love for what the car means to him, and his appreciation for history and his appreciation for preservation. So I'm not exactly the same. I like to love and drive and enjoy cars. So I think the biggest way to understand my dad's passion for this car specifically is to realize that it wasn't until 2012 that these cars really started to appreciate and had any value at all. Imagine, for years, you couldn't sell a Miura, and even some of the best examples traded for 100,000, 150,000 for 20, 30 years. So it was never about the money. It was never about value. It was truly his love for the car. I own a vintage car dealership in Miami called Curated, and we recently sold an incredible Lamborghini Miura to Polo Storico. We bought and sold Eddie Van Halen's Lamborghini Miura. We've found Miuras in barns, and we've been around a lot of Miuras. And to realize the value today of a car that's anywhere from $1 million to $3 million, and see collectors' appreciation for it today. But to witness my dad's appreciation for it from day one is really what's impressive.